This MacBook could be Apple's most dangerous gamble yet. And it all has to do with one thing that Apple is missing. It was only until last year that we finally got a redesign for the MacBook Pro, which was badly needed as the previous design had been around since 2016. So this new design not only made the MacBook Pro look more modern, but also gave it thinner bezels and a larger display. But even though this was supposed to be a Pro machine, they didn't include one very important feature that pros need: upgradability. It's understandable why Apple didn't do this. Upgradability would have added cost to the product, and that would make it more expensive, something that Apple doesn't like doing. But even if it was just an option, at least giving customers the choice of paying more money for upgradable RAM and storage, Apple didn't do that either. They went with the cheapest possible solution. Lockdown SSDs that are soldered onto the logic board and RAM that is also locked down but can be upgraded by the customer when they purchase their device, but cannot be changed after. But this means that in a few years, these MacBooks will become outdated as you won't be able to keep up with the latest software requirements. So now it's time for Apple to make their next big move and release a brand new MacBook. The question is, what's next? Well, there have been so many rumors about this new device that we decided to put them all together and see how realistic they actually are. And in my opinion, some of these are far-fetched, while others might actually happen. But before we get into all that, I think it's important to cover why Apple needs to make this next move. Well, ever since the introduction of the M1 MacBook Air, the entire laptop market has changed. Companies such as Asus, Acer, and Lenovo, they've all begun including Apple SM1 chips in their laptops and calling them ultra-light gaming laptops or thin and light business laptops. And that S because those companies realized that Apple created a chip that has way more performance than any Intel or AMD chip out there, while also being incredibly efficient, which makes it perfect for a laptop. As a result, people aren't buying Windows computers anymore. Instead, they're buying MacBooks, even if they don't care about having a closed ecosystem and missing certain features. Now, I'm not going to go through every single rumor here, but rather only the ones that I believe are realistic or at least possible. First off, let's talk about the name. What will this new MacBook be called? Well, Bloomberg's Mark Gurman believes that it will simply be called MacBook, kind of like the iBook days, which I actually really like. We know that Apple wants to phase out the word Pro from its products, as they've already done with iPad Pro, and are in the process of doing it with the Mac Pro. So the only thing left would be the MacBook Pro. Next up, we have the design. How will this new MacBook look? Well, in terms of the actual form factor, there won't be much change here, as it will still be 14 and 16 inches. But the changes will come in the form of it being thinner and lighter, as the current MacBook Pros are quite heavy. This is because of the powerful chips inside, but also because of the extra ports that Apple added, which were sorely needed, but did add quite a bit of weight. However, with the new MacBook, it seems that Apple will be removing those ports and going back to a thinner design similar to the MacBook Air. But unlike the MacBook Air, there will be no touch bar. Instead, there will be a full keyboard with function keys. Another change is that this MacBook will have smaller bezels than the current MacBook Pro. Now, I was skeptical of this rumor when I first heard it, but then I started looking into it further, and I realized that this could actually happen. You see, Apple currently uses a 16:9 aspect ratio for all of its displays, even though most other manufacturers use a 16:10 aspect ratio. So this means that a 16-inch MacBook Pro actually has a larger screen area than a 16-inch MacBook Air. However, the MacBook Air is smaller because of the smaller bezels. Now, this might not seem like much, but in reality it does make a difference. For example, here are two monitors side by side, one with a 16:9 aspect ratio and the other with a 16:10 aspect ratio. Even though the larger monitor is 16:9, the smaller monitor is actually taller and gives you more vertical space to work with, which is exactly what Apple needs for their new MacBook. You see, right now you cannot fit a 16-inch 16:10 display in a 16-inch chassis because of the bezels. But if Apple reduces the bezel's thickness, then this would be possible, resulting in a larger display that would be perfect for professionals. And this is something that they absolutely need, as otherwise they will lose to Windows computers, which already have larger displays. And speaking of displays, it seems that the resolution will also be increased to 2K. Currently, the resolution is 256 pixels per inch. But the new MacBook will bump that to 288 pixels per inch. Now, this might not sound like much, but when you compare the two side by side, you can definitely tell the difference, as the image is noticeably sharper. On top of that, the brightness of the display will also be increased from 500 nits to 1000 nits, which is great as it will allow us to better see what we're reworking on in low-light environments. But perhaps the biggest change will be in the form of upgradability. Finally, we'll be able to upgrade our RAM and storage without having to buy a completely new MacBook. Now, I was unsure if I should include this rumor in this video as it's not fully confirmed. But according to multiple sources, it does seem like Apple is at least considering it, so who knows? Maybe we'll see it in the next model. Speaking of models, Apple will be offering 2 different variants of this MacBook, just like they do with the MacBook Pro, a cheaper 14-inch variant and a more powerful 16-inch variant. Both of these will be using the M2 Pro and the M2 Max chips respectively. And when it comes to the battery life, well, it will stay the same as the current MacBook Pros, which is excellent as they have the longest battery life out of any laptop on the market. Now, when it comes to the price, I believe that it will stay the same as the MacBook Pros, which means that the 14-inch will start at $2,000 and the 16-inch at $2,500, of course. The price will go up depending on the specs that you choose, but at least it will, and be more expensive than the MacBook Pro, which I think is fair as this will be replacing the MacBook Pro and offering the same performance, but with a much better display. But here's the problem. Apple is planning to release this new MacBook in October of this year, which means that they'll be releasing it less than a year after the MacBook Pro. And this is where things get a little bit tricky. You see, usually when Apple releases a new version of a product, they'll discontinue the older versions. For example, the iPhone 13 is still being sold alongside the iPhone 14 because they're completely different products. But this is not the case with the MacBook Pro and this new MacBook, as they are essentially the same product. So it makes sense to discontinue the MacBook Pro and focus on selling this new MacBook instead. But the problem with that is that Apple has already spent millions of dollars marketing the MacBook Pro. So if they discontinue it now, then they'll have to spend even more money on marketing this new MacBook, which will eat into their profits. Not only that, but the MacBook Pro has only been out for a year, meaning that customers who bought it won't be upgrading anytime soon. So this new MacBook will have to compete against the MacBook Pro, which will lower sales even more. And this is where things get really tricky. You see, Apple isn't like other companies such as Samsung or Huawei who rely on high sales numbers to make a profit. No, Apple's strategy has always been to sell fewer products at a higher margin. For example, take a look at the iPhone. Apple sells far fewer iPhones per year than Android competitors such as Samsung, but they make far more money. So Apple doesn't really care about selling millions of units. They just want to make sure that each unit that they sell is profitable. And that's why I think that this gamble could be Apple's most dangerous move yet. They're taking a risk and betting everything on this new MacBook, hoping that customers will forget about the MacBook Pro and instead buy this new device. But it's not going to be easy. There's still a lot of demand for the MacBook Pro, both from new customers and current MacBook owners who are due for an upgrade. So it is gone. Take a lot of convincing to get them to buy the new MacBook instead. But I think that Apple has a good shot at pulling this off. The MacBook Pro has a lot of downsides, such as a poor display, no upgradability, and a lack of ports. And Apple is already aware of this as they've been fixing these issues one by one over the past year. For example, they've already fixed the port issue by adding an SD card slot and an HDMI port to the MacBook Pro. And they've also improved the display quality by making it brighter and reducing the bezels. And I think that by the time they launch this new MacBook, they'll be able to fix all of these issues and convince customers to buy the new model instead. This is why I believe that the MacBook is Apple's most dangerous gamble yet. If it succeeds, then Apple will be able to create an even bigger gap between themselves and their competition. But if it fails, then they'll be stuck with a bunch of unsold inventory, and they'll have to resort to lowering prices, which is something that Apple never wants to do. Either way, this is gone. Be a very interesting move for Apple, and I can't wait to see how it plays out. Let me know what you guys think about this new MacBook and whether you think Apple's gamble will pay off. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.